When I was growing up, I did not understand my mother. In my young eyes, my mother was one of those World War II army tanks, roughshotting over any terrain and obliterating any obstacle that stood in the path of her accomplishing what she wanted to accomplish. My mother hated the word can't. It simply was not in her vocabulary. And she hated whining. It was dangerous for us kids if we engaged in whining. When I was in the 6th grade, I got into this terrible habit of leaving my clothes strewn all over the floor. When my mother would tell me to pick them up, I would whine and say, "Oh, I forgot, I just can't." Well, I can't say that my mother didn't warn me. One day when I was walking home from school with my little 6th grade buddies, I saw a block from our house, hanging on the trees, the hedges, and the rose bushes, my shirts, my underwear, and my trainer bras. How could my mother do such a thing? I just didn't understand. As I grew older, my criticisms of my mother increased. Why was my mother so forceful? Why did my mother have to haggle over every price instead of just accepting the price on the tag? And why, when we drove anywhere, did Mother have that furrowed brow, her hands tightly clenched to the wheel? I just didn't understand it. In fact, I was 40 years old before I really knew and understood the story of my mother. When she was 81 and I was 40, she wrote her life's history, and I also got access to 2 of her journals. I began to read. Apparently, this can-do attitude of my mother was present from the very beginning. My mother was born in 1906. When she was 6 years old, her older brothers would take her twin sister by the hand and lift her twin over the snowdrifts of Idaho, while my mother would trudge along by herself, saying, "I can do this myself." When my mother was 18 years old, she went immediately into nurse's training, and she became even tougher. After nurse's training, my mother fell in love with a lovely wavy-haired boy by the name of Angus. He gave her a ring, they were engaged, and it was time to meet the parents. All weekend long, Mrs. Cannon looked disapprovingly at my mother. And on the last day that they were there, my mother was passing along beside the library and she heard Mother Cannon talking to Angus. Well, I know she's a lovely, intelligent girl, Angus, but she has no lineage. Her parents are Swedish peasants. She has absolutely no roots. Mother gave Angus back the ring and broke the engagement. But she was still in love with Angus. She enrolled at a university, began dating again, though her heart was not in it. I was reading in her journal, and I could see that there was one particular boy who was becoming serious about my mother. And I kept saying as I was reading this journal, "Don't do it! Don't do it! Don't marry him! You don't love him!" But despite her misgivings, she did marry this boy named Ted. She got an idea what life was going to be like with Ted shortly after they were married. They jumped in her car. He did not have a car. They put their meager belongings in the car, and they drove to Salina, Utah, hot, dusty Salina in the heat of the summer, where Ted was going to make it big with the San Diego Produce Company. They got out of the car in Salina on that first day and immediately were beset with flies. Flies on their hair, flies on their faces. They fled into the house, which was filthy. Mother was not afraid of hard work and she began to clean up the house. But the thing that she could not deal with were those flies. They buzzed around her while she was trying to clean up. They buzzed around her while she was doing dinner. And every day she would say to Ted, "Ted, when you're in town," they lived 3 miles out, "when you're in town, please get me some screen so I can screen out those flies." But every day Ted would whine and say, "Oh, I forgot." One day Ted came home with unexpected guests. Mother just smiled. She had fixed a lovely spread: roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, and rice pudding with raisins. They all sat down to dinner, and Ted noticed that my mother had used a different seasoning for the food. But it wasn't until he took a big scoop of mashed potatoes and came eye to eye with the dead body of a fly did he realize that they were having roast beef and flies, mashed potatoes and flies, green beans and flies, and rice pudding with raisins and flies. My mother got her screens, but the marriage did not last. Ted simply could not make a living. My mother would go to the butcher shop to get bones to make them a thin soup to subsist upon. Mother wrote in her life history that if the times hadn't been so hard, or maybe if I'd loved him more in the beginning, it would have worked. My mother married again, this time to the love of her life, my father. He read her whole plays of Shakespeare while she did the dishes. He wrote her poetry, and he sent her red roses. No couple could have been happier in 1940 when they were married, or no couple more devastated in 1941 when war broke out and my father was drafted. He went to get his physical. The physician called both my mother and father in. You won't be going to the army. You have glomerulonephritis, a kidney disease. It is incurable. Between the years of 1941 and 1950, my mother and father tried to cheat time, and they had 4 children in those years. In December of 1941, when it was time for mother to go to the hospital for this child, my father was too ill, and my mother drove herself. After this last child was born, my father's condition worsened, and he became blind from the nephritis and was permanently bedfast. In March of 51, my father buzzed the buzzer that was beside his bed. My mother came in. He said, "It is time. Time. It is time for me to go." Time when her heart was breaking. Time when he was the love of her life. He passed away that night. Both my father and mother thought that they were set for life. My father owned a construction company, and he had given the management over to others when he became very ill. But when my mother got looking into it after my father's death, she found that the company had been grossly mismanaged, and she was now thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars worth in debt. Her attorney said, "Declare bankruptcy. You can't pay this money back." "I will pay back every cent." And she did. When I was 7 years old, my mother was very, very excited. Being a nurse, she had seen the devastating effects of polio, and the Salk polio vaccine was coming to our little town of Idaho Falls. The 7-year-olds were to be given the shot. I received the shot and promptly became very ill. It was a bad batch. 2 children in our town of Idaho Falls died, but of course, I recovered. About a week later, my mother went to pick up the black telephone beside her bed, and she went to say hello, but no sound would come up over her vocal cords. She thought maybe she had some kind of cold virus, some kind of laryngitis. She waited a couple of days, and then she finally went to the doctor. The doctor said, "Well, I don't know what this is. I'm sending you to a specialist." Mother went to the specialist. The specialist said, "This is psychosomatic. I'm sending you to a psychiatrist." The psychiatrist blew smoke rings in my mother's face, and he said, "You can talk if you want to. Come on, spit it out. Who are you angry with? What are you angry about?" My mother plunked the $15 on his desk and left. She finally found a specialist who told her what was the matter. "You have polio. Your vocal cords are frozen open. You will not speak again." From reading my mother's story, I found that she had been a popular toast mistress of community banquets. She had been a frequent talent doing comedy readings for community events. She had had a beautiful, beautiful alto voice. And now she had 5 children to raise. For her to not have a voice was not acceptable to my mother. She taught herself how to burp air up and over those frozen vocal cords to make sound. Little children would say to her, "Why do you talk so funny?" And some people would just dismiss my mother as not being, or as being intellectually incompetent. But us kids could understand her, and that's what mattered to her. Because she didn't have full voice, she could no longer work in the hospital. So she got a job working in a little nursing home about 30 miles from our town of Idaho Falls. When I was a teenager, I remember my mother putting on her warm, heavy coat and braving the cold, the wind, the blizzards that only my hometown and state of Idaho could have to get to work all night long. In the morning, coming home, getting us up, feeding us breakfast, sending us off to school, sleeping a few hours, and then going and dealing with all the rental issues that she had, being an apartment owner. My mother saw to it that all of us kids received an education and got started in life. When my mother was 89, my aunt, her twin sister, broke her hip, and my mother took care of my aunt until she passed away. My mother lived to be 93 years of age. Her can-do attitude and her no whining attitude present at all times. When I was young, I hated this can-do attitude. But once I knew my mother's story, it has become my greatest legacy. When my mom was faced with the trouble, she said, "I can." When my mom's life was in a rubble, she said, "I can." When I was young, I said I couldn't face it. She's too strong, I just can't take it. She bullies the salesman, she speaks her own mind. But most of all, she never lets me whine. Wah, 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 wah. You can sing with me if you want. Wah, 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 wah. Now I'm grown, I really get the picture. She was strong, she was a mixture. She taught me things I needed to know. When you're faced with trouble, just go, 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 and no whining. Wah, 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 wah. What a woman.